back with Dr. Joe. As Joe said, people think that I have probably died, but I am here. And welcome to the Life Mastery Podcast again. I'm getting reintegrated here. Joe?
It's been a tough stretch without you, man.
Yeah, thank you. So, I've kind of been all over the place, done a lot of traveling this month, and could probably do a podcast on the experiences that I had while I was away. But
for sure.
So today, though, we're going to talk about, we're in the macro mastery segment. What's the topic, Joe?
Well, just to give you a little more time to reintegrate yourself back into normal life after all of your trips. I've been on the road as well, and I've gotten to attend a couple lectures. I've gotten to speak to some people, and it's just funny to me. I keep having this recurring thought that every generation has to relearn the same lesson. So this is going to get a little philosophical to start.
Okay,
but
I like that.
I think I'm certainly old enough, and you might be seeing this, but people who are coming up behind us in the fitness industry and maybe even psychology, you see the up-and-comers and they get really excited about certain topics and it becomes the wave of the day. And you're thinking, well, gosh, this is kind of subtle. This is what I learned 20 years ago in college, or, here's all this body of research, and why are people treating this like it's novel?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, every generation does have its heroes and its media mouthpieces and spokespeople and all that. So whoever has the loudest voice kind of generates the topical churn. And I keep getting bombarded with this more than ever. Even though we know fads come and go and everything is recycled, it just seems like, possibly because of social media and how fast interactions and communication travel, it just seems like it's coming at us with more venom, so to speak. People get very excited about defending one thing versus another. And so I wanted to take that as a premise that we've got these new generations coming up who are having to learn some of the basics. And I think we need to ground some of today's current topical moments into this categorical, I'm going to call it the Big Five nutrition grid or something like that.
Okay.
Matter of fact, it's exactly what I wrote about 15 years ago in my first book. What a horrible cover. But, this whole topic has made me go back to some of those things, and I'm interested in just going through some of those basics.
Awesome. That sounds fun. As you're talking, I'm thinking about how when I was in college and studying advanced nutrition, lately I've been finding myself coming back to the same concepts and the same equations, and I've pulled out those old books because while, yes, research has advanced and progressed, a lot of the same tenets still hold true. I've been talking with a number of people recently too, who and these are people prominent in the fitness community, but who are working to understand more nutrition. They may be working with endurance athletes, and they're like, I'm more confused than ever. I don't even know what to think about all the different things that I'm hearing about keto and intermittent fasting and what's going to be best for my athletes. And so I think this will be very, very helpful.
So here's where the idea kind of started too. When I started writing what is going to be one of our next books specifically on nutrition, I did go back to my original notes, which were Dr. Joe's building blocks of nutrition. And the reason I set it up like that was I wanted to show people that if you start with this foundation, which is just energy expenditure, calories in, calories out, then you can get more specific and build your way up into greater competency. But even if you have to fall back into one of those earlier platforms, let's say your macronutrient ratios weren't perfect for the day, something else wasn't perfect, as long as you were able to at least stay within that calorie range, you're going to be okay. So this was really the beginnings of flexible dieting. And as I was coming back to that, I ran across somebody else's content. I think his name is Dr. Mike Israetel. I might have that wrong, but he's somebody who's written prolifically recently in the nutrition industry. and he has a nutrition pyramid, which was almost exactly word for word what mine was almost 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And then Eric Helms has a book that he's writing a second edition to, and he asked me to review it and write a foreword. And he has a pyramid exactly the same way, exact same steps.
Yeah.
So ironically, this was funny. He said, so I guess your foreword is going to be a cease and desist letter from your attorney.
Yeah.
But it's what I said. It's that everybody, through this form of collective consciousness, if you're in academia and you're studying nutrition, you're probably always going to fall back to those foundational basic elements. And that's how you judge every new idea, every new study, every new fad. And so it doesn't surprise me that these people who are in academia end up with the same kind of mindset.
Yeah.
And so I think that's just going to be important to give to our viewers and listeners and let them be able to more easily judge some nutritional premises that they come across.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying is, while the potential exists for it to become very, very, very complicated, it doesn't have to. Yes, with all of the research, it can become more complex. We get into each of the different complexities with each of the different types of dieting, but at a ground level, there are just, if we want to call them truths, kind of universal truths that we can keep coming back to. And there are 5. And you said number 1 is
just energy expenditure. And I was very happy. I get to spend a day or two with Lane in Vegas. He and Paul Ravella had a camp after the Olympia. And I told Lane afterwards that, that was by far the best content I think you've ever presented, because he's writing a large book, a comprehensive book on fat loss. And so that has made him really go back into the basic study of nutrition. Not, hey, here's a new article, let's talk about that, or here's a new study.
Right.
And so, he started right here. It's just energy expenditure. He even said on his Rogan podcast that, by definition, if you're somebody who says, well, I tried this diet and I dieted really hard and it didn't work, I didn't lose any weight. By definition, then, regardless what you did, you were not in a calorie deficit.
Yeah.
So that is the most important thing to understand, is whatever diet you're looking at and whatever you might be applying and whatever your experience might be, you have to start with a presumption that you're in a calorie deficit.
Right. Okay.
So we know that has to do with energy expenditure as well. So you have training, exercise, non-exercise, daily activity, thermogenesis. That way, everybody likes to talk about NEAT right now. That's a big buzzword. There are all kinds of ways to make sure that you're increasing expenditure, but there are some efficiencies we can talk about when we get into the next couple steps, which will be, meal spacing, how you structure your day, which gets into different forms of fasting and time-restricted eating versus grazing. When you get into macronutrient profiles, how much protein, et cetera, you definitely can create, again, some fat loss or fat gain efficiencies and inefficiencies. So as we go up this scale, which, like I said, I originally had in kind of blocks, so you could envision yourself stepping up each level of complexity. It's not just to complicate it, and it's not just to say, well, you might want to try this if you're advanced. They really are important. They're all on that grid of the big 5 needs to attain fat loss. But I'll ask you, Kori, just in terms of energy expenditure in achieving a calorie deficit, when you're working with clients, is that something that is immediately understood, or do they get lost in the weeds of all the other minutia?
I think for the most part, most people understand that they need to be using more energy than they're consuming. I think it becomes complicated for them when they have read or have been told that they should be able to eat a lot more food than they are, or that they should not go below a certain number of calories. Otherwise, it's incredibly dangerous and they're really going to hurt themselves and harm their metabolisms in a significantly like non-reversible way. So I think that's the biggest thing. The other thing that I see is them wanting to really focus on increasing exercise and increasing exercise and increasing exercise, because that seems to be maybe more psychologically easy for them than moderating their food intake, just doing more exercise and burning more calories. But there's a large sort of misunderstanding about how much they're actually burning when they do the increased amount of exercise, and them not considering that, man, this is we could get into a whole thing, but that it's not just the amount of energy that they're burning from the exercise included in, maybe they're using a watch or they're looking at the calories on a machine, but it's what they would have burned without exercising at the same time too. That's what the number's including. Mm-hmm. And then I had one other thought, but it's escaping me now about, and here's the other piece is the more they start to exercise, the more then they start to consume. Correct. And they can almost do that. They don't know they're doing it, but it's just kind of a natural, they go together. The more you exercise, the hungrier you get. So your appetite increases. So it's a fine balance, and I don't find it necessarily difficult to talk with them about it and to teach them about what's happening and how to balance for their individual needs. But those seem to be the most prominent misconceptions and misunderstandings.
Mm-hmm. And I'm gonna alter, especially just because of the conversation we're having right now. I'm editing as we go. My new building blocks, because I want to include training as kind of that second level. If I say that energy intake or just energy balance is that first foundational step, I don't want to include training in that. I want that to be thought of as separately because of everything you're saying. There are some misconceptions and there are some change that happen physiologically. So to create the best plan and make sure your body is adjusting to that in terms of hunger and what you might eat, that's really important stuff. But back to the first step of just energy intake, I'll give you an example of a client recently who was struggling, just wasn't finding that traction, would lose a little bit and gain it back, lose a little bit, gain it back. And finally we had this, moment of, I said, listen, you have to at least eat the same things every day for a week. Let's do something to make sure there is no chance for any inaccuracies. Because up to this point, she was saying, everything's fine. It's perfect. I'm giving you my food logs. This is what I'm eating. In that moment, she said, yeah, I've been fucking up and not telling you. Like I just, I binge, I don't write things down. I take a bite. I do this. And so I said, okay, look, I can't help you unless we really get this first step done. Like energy balance has to be there. If you're not losing, by definition, you're not in a calorie deficit.
Right.
You might be working really hard. You might be trying really hard, but that one extra meal a day or snack or light binge is killing you.
Effort, all of that effort that you psychologically feel like you're making doesn't mean that or equate to a deficit.
Right. So
mathematically.
So we had that come to Jesus moment, like, come to Joe moment, maybe. Yeah. And so she agreed, okay, I'm ready. And so for the next 2 weeks, she lost weight consistently, like a pound. And then it leveled off to maybe half a pound a week for 2 or 3 weeks. And she sent me another email and it ended with whatever. That was the end, whatever. Because she was just saying, no matter what I do, I'm not losing fast enough. And I had to say, look, you may have the world's slowest metabolism, just for the sake of argument. It is a continuum.
Right.
Half of people are lower than average, half of people are above. Let's say that you're lower. With a 120-pound frame, half a pound a week consistently,
I'd be happy with that.
It's good. That's a good, that's not bad at all. You have now created an energy balance that shows a consistent deficit. So that's what I mean, Kori, by regardless what kind of diet methodology you want to use,
Yes.
if you miss this first step, you can't expect magic to happen in anywhere else on the pyramid or the building blocks or the scale. Everything has to presuppose and create a calorie deficit. If you're not losing, you're not in a calorie deficit. So the answer may be easier to achieve further up or down the scale, but you have to know that that's the first block. So,
and in order to understand whether we're in a caloric deficit, we don't even necessarily need to track, but we need to have some way of monitoring, right? Even if that's weighing ourselves consistently and getting the trends. And if the trend isn't moving downward, then we have a really good indicator that the deficit is not in place.
Right.
But if we really want to optimize the losses, if that's our goal, then actually getting the math down and knowing how much is going in is super important.
So the second step that we already talked about is the training, really accelerating that energy expenditure. And we've talked a lot about that in previous podcasts. I presented some research showing how epinephrine and norepinephrine, growth hormone, testosterone, things like that can be elevated by 1,000% if you're doing maximum training. And I talked about that 8-12 interval split, 8 seconds on, 12 seconds off, that has been studied so far, and this may change with more research. So far, that has been the most effective way to burn body fat. 8 maximum seconds on, 12 seconds off.
How many times?
Up to 20 minutes.
Up to 20 minutes, not 20 intervals, but 20 minutes.
You can start with 5 minutes at a time. People in their research, some of them had to start at 5 minutes because that's all they could do. But through the course of the study, they were able to increase. And they showed, compared to steady state, normal intervals, wind gates, other types, that kind of maximum effort hit all 3 energy systems so effectively that you maximized your effort.
Well, in a 12-second, it's not really off because your heart rate is barely coming down from the 8-second maximal effort. So you are literally going at max the entire time.
And basically you're just recycling ATP at that point. That's what that 12-second interval does. But here's what's interesting. In my own anecdotal, self-studies with a slow metabolism, the amount of training I do is key. I've gotten back into the habit of doing something in the morning and evening, even if it's just 10 minutes. Sometimes in the morning, I'll just come in, I'll do 10 minutes super duper hard. Then I'll have breakfast. I'll do that fasted because it's only 10 minutes later in the day. But if I'm doing something like that, where at 2 or 3 times during the day, I at least have some activity, I can lose weight very consistently. If I don't do that, dropping calories is just more suffering, and I don't lose as fast.
I hear you, and I'm the same way. Yes.
So that's something to consider. We're not going to go deep into all of these big 5 principles, but I just want people to be aware of the kind of information and implications that are out there.
So let's review. Bottom line, foundation of the big 5.
Energy balance. So
energy balance.
Intake versus what I would call just basal metabolic rate. But then the second, and that's why these 2 steps are kind of combined, is your training emphasis. How you're going to train, how consistent you're going to be able to train.
Frequency, intensity, duration. Okay.
Absolutely. So that's part of your overall plan. And then the third block is going to just be macronutrients. And when you look at protein, carbs, and fats, again, we have so much content in our podcast already on this. I don't want to get into it too much, but and also because I want you to be able to go through any type of diet methodology through this grid, and it may work for you. If you have the right protein, carbs, and fats, and you're intermittent fasting, that could be different than if you're not doing a time-restricted eating.
Right.
For example, it probably does you no good to have 100 grams of protein at one meal twice a day. If you're doing some form of intermittent fasting, you might need to pare that down and simply rely on less protein.
Mm-hmm.
So again, no matter what you're doing, what kind of diet, if it's not working, as you said, you have to have some metric by which to measure that, which is obviously going to be your progress.
Okay.
So I will say it is interesting, since we're talking about how every generation has to kind of relearn the same things. At Lane's first lecture, I saw him last month, and then on Rogan, he went through 2 or 3 studies that are in our next book, things that you and I have been talking about for months, maybe a couple years. One of them, which I even put in our new National Academy of Metabolic Science textbook, is the fact that over 3 weeks, one study gave people 250 grams of carbs above their maintenance needs. So they were in a calorie surplus to the tune of 250 grams of carbs a day for 3 weeks straight, 21 days straight, and only 6% of those calories got converted to fat. So
I remember this data, Joe, and I was freaking blown away.
It surprised me.
I'm putting myself in the position of eating 250 grams more carbs per day for 3 weeks, and I'm gaining weight. So let me ask you this, and I don't know if you know the answer based on the study, but did protein and fat come down as carbs were increased?
No, that was a calorie abundance.
Wow.
And so this is what I've been asked a couple times when I say that complex carbohydrates have almost the same thermic effect as protein. We all learned in textbooks that fat has almost 0 to 3%. Protein has 30%. Carbs only have 5 or so percent. So just eat more protein, 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 protein. And I say that I've always said that's just not true, because you could have something from sugar to fibrous carbs, and the context of your day matters, whether you're going to eat those or use those carbs, assimilate them or not. So I've always counted complex carbs as almost as much as protein. And now I think research is going to start bearing that out with studies like this. That's fact that
extra calories.
Yeah, it was like 5,000 extra calories or something like that.
That would be 7,000 per week.
21 days. I mean, but it shows you the turnover of how you use carbs when they're there. Our body's cells will use glucose first. Then we have our liver, our muscle tissue to store it. You do ramp. I mean, your body is obviously looking to store fat. But here's an interesting nuance. When you can combine carbs, a lot of carbs, with a lot of fat, your body's going to use the carbs, but you will store the fat.
Right.
So you do have to, if you're going to have a higher carb diet, which is more efficient, you do have to make sure your fat is moderately low.
Yes.
And so, I saw one of our quotes from a podcast already being quoted in other people's social media, when I reported that the American Journal of Medical Association did a 59 study meta-analysis, and they ranked the most effective diets for sustainable weight loss, and low carb diets or ketogenic diets showed up nowhere. Not one single version of that ranked in their top 59. And again, that's because of what we're describing. You can't have both. You can't have high carb and high fat. You could be moderate. You could go on one of those kind of balanced zone-ish diets. But again, I think then you're going to find that that's less efficient than if you're just higher in carbs. But for the sake of our building blocks, this being the third step, or I'm sorry, fourth.
Fourth step.
I forgot to.
We need another review, Joe.
Meal spacing. The macronutrient ratios, I think, is where you can get a lot of efficiency. That's why I'm putting it higher up on that scale. If you have the right amount of food intake, energy balance, you're training, Then you've decided what your meal spacing is going to be. That's the third. Then you can definitely play around with your ratios, macronutrient ratios, and see what works best for you.
Okay. Say those again. 1, 2, 3.
So, okay. So the foundational block, or the first principle, is calorie intake, calorie expenditure, or more broadly termed, just calorie, or I should say energy balance.
Okay.
Let's call it energy balance. Number 2, which is part of energy balance, is your actual exercise strategy.
Okay.
Number 3 is how you're going to structure those meals. And again, we've done so much on intermittent fasting and time restricted eating. I don't want to talk about that too much, but I will say the principle you have to keep in mind is that it works best to stagger your meals based on your energy needs. So around your workouts, you might be eating every 90 to 120 minutes if you're starving and you just need it. But you should pick some points in your day where you may not be eating for 4 or 5 hours because you just don't need it. And you need some gaps in your day to tap into body fat stores.
That is a super important point, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. It's something that, I know that all of the Diet Doc clinicians work on really extensively with their clients. And just for me too, I've shared with my clients that around my workouts that's a time when I am most hungry, because I work out first thing in the morning. So from 4:30 in the morning to 1 or 2, those are when my biggest meals are going to be. And I can usually have a larger space of time between like lunch and dinner. So that's my window of opportunity if I'm working on fat loss, to really dig into those storage places. Yeah.
And then the 5th. So if we get finally up to the 5th element, 5th principle, it's just the collective minutia, where you get to focus on some of the minor things that might help you. Things like hydration, things like sleep, even micronutrients. I would just say all of those things. Ironically, a lot of people like to pick those out and say that's the major thing for them, and they're not. I think collectively they can end up having an impact, but you've got to have your calorie or energy balance. You've got to have your training factored in there. You've got to have your meal spacing and design, built in there to work effectively. And these are things you can tinker with and experiment and do something this week and see if you like it better. Up in that 4th block, macronutrients, we could even talk about, quality sources. Right. Even if you're keeping your carbohydrate or fat levels the same, what if you change those sources? That can have a really big impact for people who are consistent.
Yeah. Sleep, stress. I hear that one a lot. Stress is preventing me from losing weight. I know plenty of people who have stressful lives and can lose weight very successfully because they've taken care of all of those other elements that you've listed. Psychologically, it can not feel fun if you're operating at high stress levels and you're not getting really good sleep. But yeah, I do think that when you dial in the first 4 elements, the 5th doesn't play quite such a larger role.
And we will,
but
and we'll have these written out in the show notes, but I do want to leave on one note, Kori, because I think it's good for our listeners and viewers to have some extra resources to look this stuff up. Some people really like to dig into this. And I will say that, Lane Norton's new book that's going to be coming out on I think it's called Fat Loss Forever or something like that. I know he's going to have a ton of research. It's probably just based on how I've seen his writing in the past. It's probably going to be pretty academic and just going through the nuts and bolts of the studies. Eric Helm's book, which is coming out, the 2nd edition, I've again previewed that, and it's fantastic. And also not only giving that research rigor, but it's very applicable. And
Nice.
then our book, 50 Days to Your Best Life. I know my whole premise for 20 years has been being applicable, being accessible.
Oh yeah.
So
How
I
do I
think,
put it into place in my own life?
right.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily like doing what Lane and Eric have done and just saying, here's a tome of research.
Mhm.
I like to give content that shows people exactly how to do it, make it easy,
Right.
make it fit into your life. So I think all of those resources are tremendous and complementary. So Lane's book, I think you can pre-order now. I know Eric's is going to be out hopefully in December. You and I are working on a couple more books that are going to really even make things easier to apply.
From a
But
psychological perspective as well.
absolutely, absolutely. So that's it. Those are the 5 principles, and like I said, we'll put them in the show notes, and these are going to show up again in our next nutrition book. So hopefully can give people some clarity.
Great. Well, thank you guys for joining us on the Diet Doc Life Mastery podcast. We will see you again soon.